All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. So last month, almost a month ago, May 17th, I had an event in New York City with Sohrab Ahmari, who's the US editor of Unheard. I was in town for an academic conference, thought we should do some sort of live event while I was there. And I thought this was a really interesting conversation because Sohrab is somebody who, I've known for a long time. He's certainly a personal friend, but, he's kind of the ultimate personal friend, political frenemy, because there's a list of things that are important to me that we would agree on. Ranging from the war in Iran to the importance of stronger labor unions. And then there is a list of things that are very important to me that we would strongly disagree on, right? Sohrab is a very devout Catholic, and he has many social conservative positions. He's certainly not a socialist. And the list goes on, right? I mean, the first time that I ever really interacted with him was when Compact magazine, which he used to be one of the editors of, first launched, and I wrote a critique for Jacobin of kind of the mission statement of Compact, and then he came on the show to have a little debate about that. We did another one when his book Tyranny Inc. came out, which is a book that he was on many left-wing podcasts to promote for good reasons. It's about sort of workplace tyranny, and of course there's much in that book for people like us to agree with. But nonetheless, when he came on, we ended up spending most of the time arguing about whether we should just have the kind of New Deal class compromise that somebody like Sohrab wants, or whether really the solution to workplace tyranny is to go all the way to have socialism, which is obviously what I want. In between, we'd done an exchange of articles. They were published at the same time in Compact magazine, again, back when he was an editor there. So he co-wrote back then an article with Matthew Schmidt called Trump is Still the One, saying, this is 2022, right? Saying that Trump should run for president again in 2024. Endorsing Trump. And I wrote an article, like a point counterpoint thing, saying no, Trump was awful. He spent his whole first term doing an orgy of corporate deregulation and union busting, and there was plenty of foreign policy hawkishness, even if he didn't start any new wars in the first term. And in fact, in my article, I made the case that Bernie Sanders should run again for a third time. Even I, by the way, am under no illusions that Bernie Sanders, at the age of 87 or whatever he's going to be, is going to run for president in 2028. I'd probably support him if he did, but even I am realistic enough to know that that's not happening. But I was still holding out hope in 2024. And of course, I would stand by every word of that article that I wrote in 2024, whereas Sohrab, to his credit, has had second thoughts since Trump became president again, in particular, the war in Iran. I think caused him to turn against the Trump administration very hard, which is not to say that there aren't still plenty of disagreements about the Trump administration and related topics between the two of us. Meanwhile, we also, over the years, on the one hand, you can find a few times since he became editor of Unheard that you can find Sohrab in Unheard taking one side of an issue and me and Jacobin taking the other one. That happened about the warmth of collectivism controversy with Zoran Mamdani, for example. We ended up writing battling articles about that. That happened with the Sia Weaver controversy with Zoran. So all of which is to say, I have known the guy for a long time. Certainly there's very real friendship there personally. I've sat around drinking whiskey on the guy's rooftop And he's also been my editor for freelance stuff that I used to do for Compact and then for Unheard. And I always loved working with him. But obviously, again, there's a sort of interestingly complicated political frenemyship where we agree on some issues and strongly disagree on others. And so, because I was going to be in New York in May, thought Bar Frida in Queens, which is co-owned by our friend TJ, who was fun fact, Jason Miles' old booking agent for his music career, and has booked the live shows that Jason and I did a few years ago with the Left Reckoning guys. So we figured, hey, should do something at TJ's bar while I am in New York. And so Sohrab very graciously agreed to do this. And I thought it was a really fun conversation. It was a really interesting conversation. Yeah, Kevin, the ice stuff definitely does come up in here. That's again probably the example with the sort of most intense emotions where we were on the opposite sides. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting because again, I've known him for a very long time, but I've never had a chance to have sort of quite this long or this thoughtful public dialogue with him about the things that we agree and disagree about. So yeah, I'm excited to finally be able to share this. One quick note, it's not going to be relevant for those of you who listen to this later as a podcast, but for people who are watching on video, it's going to be very relevant. Unfortunately, we do not have a video of the whole thing. We actually have a video of a few minutes that producer emeritus Jake took on his phone, and might share that at some point. But for the whole thing, we are going to be using the audio recording, which I thought came out really nicely. The bar has a nice audio recording equipment, and I thought they did a great job with that. So this is going to be audio only as far as the thing. Obviously, I might pause during it to comment, but I'll certainly come back after it's done to comment. But meantime, let me just pull this up. All right, and oh my God, I should also say I feel so bad. I was just texting with her last night. I feel so bad for not having said this yet. So the picture that we're using, the still picture for the video, the woman in the middle is Cynthia Cook, who has been on this show multiple times in the past, of course, before, and who has certainly been on This Is Revolution many times, and is a good friend of the show, not in the way we call Ben Shapiro a friend of the show or whatever, but actually, ironically, a good friend of the show, and who who's friends with both me and Sohrab, and graciously agreed to moderate the dialogue. So, with no further ado, here is me and Sohrab, moderated by Cynthia, talking about populism in New York.
Okay, everyone. So, welcome. We're going to be talking about right versus left populism. What's the difference? What are the opposing sides? What do they think? How do they feel? So I'm Cynthia Cook, and I love populism. So let's talk about it. So, Sohrab, would you like to begin with your view of right-wing populism?
Yeah, well, thank you to all of you for coming out, including a couple of my friends and more than a couple actually in the audience. That's very sweet of you. Anyone who's been on my rooftop with me, like having too many whiskeys and cigarettes, is a dear friend, and that certainly applies to Ben, whom I've known for half a decade now. And so I really appreciate what he does in the public square, which is just utterly principled guy in every way. So very happy to be here. I think so. I'd like to start with an abstract definition of populism, which I borrow from the Belgian political theorist Chantal Mouffe, who says populist movements are ones that draw, quote, a frontier between the people versus the elite, or between the many versus the few. In a book called Toward a Left Populism from about a decade ago. And I think that's a pretty good description of populism, both what is promising about it, which is, a politics of mass participation and mass politicization, but also its limitations, because who counts as the many or who counts as the people is a fluid or mobile category. And who counts as likewise for the other side, who counts as the few or who counts as the elite. But I think I think that's like a decent working definition, and it including in its unhelpfulness, including in its limitations. And so over the past decade or so, you've seen the rise of various movements who roughly meet that definition. Obviously, Trumpism in the United States. There are all sorts of analogs across the Atlantic. Brexit. I would put the leftist Syriza movement in Greece in that bucket. I would put all sorts of kind of conservative populist tendencies across the Atlantic, law and justice in Poland, et cetera, under that bucket as well. And here's the other aspect of the definition of the Mouffe, that Chantal Mouffe's definition, which I didn't elaborate on, which is, she says, fundamentally, the populist movements are suited as a response to the neoliberal order that took hold of Western societies beginning in the late 1970s. And this is probably very basic to most of you, but the main characteristic of many of these movements is, or of neoliberalism, the one that I think we should care about, is that it tends to depoliticize things. That is, important questions about how we govern our common life, economy and immigration, et cetera, are removed from public political contestation and made to be the affairs of what she calls closed elites. And so as a result of that, for a long time, no matter which party popular majorities went to vote for, whether it was self-proclaimed social democrats like Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, or Tony Blair in Britain with the Labour Party, or whether it was George W. Bush or Thatcher, Reagan, whoever, you got kind of the same thing. You got corporate neoliberalism. And populist movements emerged to challenge that and to say that things that were thought to be beyond the kind of ken of public political contestation should actually be politicized. What do we produce? Does it make a difference whether we produce tangible things in the material economy, or if we just have an economy that's based on services and kind of high-tech software? Whom do we admit into the political community in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. So I see these as a healthy movements at their best toward repoliticizing things, but precisely because of the fact that who the people are and who the elite are is such a mobile category, it's so easy, you also see their limitations there. And so I would like to close with a kind of provocative Hollywood reference, which I think will show you where right-wing populism had promise and where it reached its limits, when we see it now in the second Trump administration very clearly. And that's a reference to the movie Eddington, which I think is a very, very good movie. But I think I have the kind of political key to like what Ari Aster was trying to say in that movie, which is this. If you haven't seen it, basically it's set in a small New Mexico town during like peak woke, peak COVID pandemic era, masking restrictions and so on. And the town is ruled by a kind of clearly a sort of up and coming Democratic politician who says all the right woke things, et cetera, and is very good about masking as long as he's in public, even though he doesn't believe in it, et cetera, et cetera. But then, meanwhile, he's pushing the interests of this big corporate, big tech company that wants to build a data center in their town. He faces a populist rebellion, essentially from cranky, conspiratorial-minded right-wing populists, including the town's sheriff, played by Joaquin Phoenix, and his mother-in-law. And they kind of actually mount a successful armed takeover of the city. They win, and the upshot is that the big tech company basically embraces the family as well, like the sort of this family that took over, and the data center continues to be developed in the town. And I think there's something very sort of prophetic about that, about how the second Trump administration especially cashed out, which is, it seemed like that various certainties about the American economy were going to be called into question. And then what you still got is the rule of the likes of Elon Musk and so on. So for me personally, I think of the experiment over the past decade of right-wing populism as an important failure. That's my giveaway here, as my bottom line, is an important failure, it was worthwhile to experiment what could be done with this political form of populism in all its nebulousness, and the fact that you can't define who the many is really, or it does, and it does it in ways that are analytically incorrect, such that like the adjunct professor, becomes the elite, whereas somehow the likes of Elon Musk and Peter Thiel are framed as, subaltern revolutionary figures. That was its limitation, but it was worth trying it. But on the whole, we are now reaching its limitations of the populist form, and but it's worthwhile because various things that were thought to be beyond political contestation are now subject to political contestation. And I see this as an opportunity for other social movements to come in and offer better, more analytically acute definitions of who the many are and who the few is, and how to actually make it such that more of our common life is subject to political contestation.
That was great. And so well said, so eloquent. Also, Sohrab, you touched on something that I wanted to start with, which is I love these two because they are so principled and reasoned. And even when they have, disagreements, we probably won't be having those YouTube clips with Sohrab Ahmari destroys Ben Burgis. I mean, we might do it for fun, just to get clicks or whatever. But they're always very reasoned and very amenable. So I really appreciate that, you two. So Ben, what do you want to say with regard to the left, sort of how the left might approach this question of populism?
Sure. Well,
and how it's played out,
I guess I should start out by admitting that I didn't watch Eddington.
No.
I've probably missed a lot of good movies in the last couple of years. I've spent a lot of that time living in Mexico, so I haven't gone to the theater much. I did go through watching every single Friday the 13th sequel, so if there's a useful political analogy to be squeezed out of that, I'm all over it. But I think that the Chantal Mouffe definition is a good starting point. But of course, what's useful about it is that it does actually capture everything that people have meant by this word, more or less. But then on the other hand, it also is infinitely malleable, right? Because you can set that frontier in so many different places. So I think one useful way to start out when you're thinking about what populism is or should be or could be is to think about the original populists in the 19th century, the people who coined the word, who were the People's Party, who were basically a movement of small farmers trying to forge alliances with urban workers to fight against big banks and big business. And contrary to the impression that you get if you get your history from Richard Hofstadter, were probably the least racist major party in late 19th century America. And I think that if you kind of start out with what those guys were about as a rough yardstick, then I think you get to a lot of my frustrations with a lot of what's been called populist over the course of the last 11 years or so, certainly in this country, also in many other places that Sohrab just referred to. Certainly to pick the most obvious lowest hanging fruit, Trump's GOP, basically seemed to me to be pro-business, anti-labor, xenophobic authoritarians, none of which really has anything to do, right, with the 19th century sense of populism, at least, right? What that political alignment was about, what it was for, and what it was against. Now, maybe history isn't the best guide here, but even if we want to, start fresh from the 2020s, it does seem to me that if you are going to talk about being for the people and against the elite in some materially meaningful sense, then you need to be in favor of redistributing away from the oligarchs, who are probably, in the Eddington example, the people who are actually profiting, right, from the data center, towards the great mass of the population, which you could do by doing things like raising the minimum wage, giving everybody health care, making it easier to form a union, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, of course, this kind of gets to the nub of why I think most of what counts as, most of what's referred to as right populism doesn't seem particularly meaningfully populist to me. In fact, one of the many reasons that I like Sohrab, who, I should say, right, if politically something of a complicated frenemy, is certainly a personal friend of mine, and somebody I've known personally and professionally for a long time at this point and have a lot of respect for. And one of the reasons that I have a lot of respect for him is that he's one of vanishingly few people in this world, this world of right populism, this sphere, who actually seems to be serious about those elements, right? That kind of economic program. So whatever kinds of, deep philosophical disagreements, we might have about abortion or God or sexuality or other things, right? That there actually are some important and interesting common premises. I should also say that to the best of my knowledge, Sohrab is the only right winger who ever took my capital class. Got through the entire book, 940 pages.
Wow.
So he's also serious about thinking through ideas, including ones that he doesn't agree with or doesn't entirely agree with, and absorbing the insights that he finds there, right? Which I have very great respect for all of that, but I do have to say that when I think about the last 11 years of Trumpism, certainly, of which about half that time has been the time that we've known each other. I have to say that I've spent all of this time very consistently saying I don't think that any of this has any serious economically popular content. I don't think that it has any serious anti-interventionist foreign policy content, without even getting into the rest of those disagreements. So at the risk of preempting our wonderful moderator, I guess one way to push this would be how much of that you agree with now, and to the extent that you do agree now in retrospect, what you think you might have seen incorrectly earlier on.
Yeah.
So,
well, because Ben has been kind of spicy in his critique of right-wing populism. He wrote a piece in 2022 in Jacobin called "Stop Trying to Make Right-Wing Social Democracy Happen. It's Not Going to Happen." He also critiqued your compact inaugural statement about having a believing in social democratic economic system, but pushing back against the libertine left.
Yeah.
So,
well, the thing is, in some ways, social democracy is a right-wing formation by definition, right? It usually has cashed out as socialism in one country. It's internationalist, but it's not globalist. A lot of social, and social democracy what makes it, and I often pair it with Christian democracy, even though there are important differences between social democrats and Christian democrats, especially in the post-war era, they formed a kind, especially the first 3 decades in the post-war era, they formed a kind of consensus such that, like, you know, they spoke the same language, and they both accepted certain things about what the political economy was like. They realized that, you know, market societies are characterized by coercion, you know, contrary to free market dogma of the 19th century that said, like, well, everyone's like free to find a better deal elsewhere. You know, having lived through the 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century, a lot of social and Christian Democrats thought that was not true, that's true, like in Econ 101 kind of picture of what the economy was like, in which, especially in a pre-industrial kind of Arcadia, where you have, you know, lots and lots of producers and lots of buyers in every market, so that there's just, you can always go find a better deal elsewhere. Under industrial conditions, you know, most markets by the late 19th century in the United States were dominated by a handful of firms. Otis Elevator, if you ever walk into a elevator in New York City, if you look at the brand that's on the, like, it's like etched into the floor, it says Otis. And it still is. But in the 19th century, there was Otis Elevator, like, dominated 90% of its market. British American Tobacco dominated 90% of its market. General Electric. So under those conditions, they thought, okay, well, you're going to have coercion in the marketplace. You don't have infinite choice of people being able to find freedom elsewhere. Given that, let's raise up the power of the other side of the market, whether that's workers in the labor market, or whether that's consumers through consumer co-ops, et cetera, such that you kind of create a social balance. But the goal was not to overthrow, by the mid-century era, their goal was not to overthrow the system. It was to kind of manage capitalism such that it was less coercive, in a way less competitive, actually, and less prone to turbulence and so on. And that, by definition, is kind of a conservative project, which is what, like, that's the critique of the hard left has always been of Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, is that they try to blunt what would otherwise be the kind of contradictions of the system through welfare states, through unions, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's, like, setting aside cultural questions that are hot button, fundamentally social and Christian democracy is a conservative project. What's foolish about much of the right is that they lament the effects of market societies on atomization, on family, et cetera, but then they want to accelerate the economic forces that would bring about the same, that have brought about and would bring about more of the same atomization. So that's like a definitional question, but I think it's important. I think here's where I would partly maybe push back against Ben is, like, 2 things. One is, look, I think making the question of what we produce, that a manufacturing economy has a certain kind of characteristic that goes with it, and that both left and right had let go of that and said, it doesn't matter what you produce, we can just, become, a completely non-manufacturing economy, and that's okay. That was a worthwhile impulse of the right-wing populists. And the other one is a whole bag of issues, and I don't want to really get into it, but is the question of immigration. It's often said that, like, this is something that J.D. Vance told me once, which is leftists forget that open borders is a component of the neoliberal program. It's why when I was, like, a conventional conservative at the Wall Street editorial page, we always pushed for making it easier to immigrate to the United States. And we did so not out of a kind of humanitarian reason, but in order to, basically because we realized it would have wage depressing effects. So that's one. And now, conversely, you could say conservatives who now call themselves populists imagine that immigration is the only element of neoliberalism. So that's the only thing they need to tackle. But I think there's just, like, useful to think about, okay, like, what about the economy, the political economy, are we willing to question? And they did that. And if there was an opening for them to do so, in a way, that's a symptom of the failure of the left in the 1980s and 90s that completely, gave up these issues and created this open field for conservative populists to fill them. The other thing I would say is there is a sort of dialectical argument I think I would make, which is for what's been useful about the conservative populist project. Conservative populists, basically, they believe that what's wrong, this is their theories, I think at its core, is that market systems are fine, but for the fact that there are outsiders coming in and giving us an unfair deal, like immigrants, foreign firms, et cetera, et cetera. So what they want is something, there's a reason Trump keeps talking about the McKinley era. They want something like the 19th century, which is an economy that is externally protected from labor competition through kind of immigration and from trade. However, internally, it's like the Wild West of capitalism. That's what you had in the late 18th century. And in a way, the result was these social and Christian democratic orders that sought to protect workers from the vagaries of the system. Now they're being taken away, and they're trying to create this kind of internal libertarian heaven. And maybe we can think of social and Christian democracy and the New Deal order as kind of somehow blunting the dialectical opposition that would otherwise arise between workers and capitalists. In other words, the fact that you have big-time capitalists on the world stage, like Elon Musk and many others, when you didn't, in the mid-century era, no one thought, who cares who manages IBM? It doesn't matter. So you have the return of the bourgeoisie as this like heroic force that wants to do certain things. And that, without the sort of blunting force of the administrative state, labor unions, et cetera, that might be an opening, to a pushback from the people that wasn't there before, because they could always rely on, this social welfare system, et cetera, et cetera. So from like a kind of revolutionary left perspective, you could say these guys have created conditions for a left that is more militant, that has an opening of so many people who are so much more, and I mean this, I think the left needs to be more militant, and not fall back on like the old structures of the 20th century, which I adore and I respect. But if the right is going to get rid of those, then let's have a left that's willing to do wildcat strikes and willing to be a lot like the labor peace. If the right is going to completely break the labor peace of the New Deal order, then let's the left be like, all right, well, you're going to get like random strikes all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly in favor of random strikes all the time. I would definitely like, I would definitely like a revival of wildcat strikes very much. But I think that two things you said kind of got to maybe the nub of the original issue about populism. So the first is, I'm glad you identified one of the weirdest things about 2024 and post-Trump, which is that he has started to identify with William McKinley. If you listen to his Joe Rogan appearance in 2024, he goes on and on about how much he loves McKinley, which I've got to say, I feel does somewhat make my point about populism, because this was the arch villain of the original populists, right? He was their arch enemy. And of course, the main thing Trump loves about him is the tariffs. And that should also maybe tell you something about the limits of tariffs as a tool of economic populism. I mean, the original populists were small farmers. They didn't like tariffs, right? They were very opposed to that. Now I'm probably, more pro-tariff certainly than they are. I mean, I think that the sort of position that like Sean Fain at the UAW takes makes sense to me. I think, that the way that they've been implemented under Trump is psychotic. That, if he is, it doesn't, like the premise that this would lead to onshoring manufacturing, assumes that as a capitalist who's thinking about building a factory in the United States, you're going to just assume that whatever the tariff rules are for this week are going to last for the next 20 years, right? Because those are the sorts of calculations that you want to make. And obviously, when they change every week, nobody's going to do that. A lot of it doesn't really make sense, right? We're going to have tariffs on coffee to protect our local American coffee industry, right? I don't know what part of America that would be. But yeah, sure. If you have targeted tariffs that can onshore some jobs in heavy industries where workers in those industries have more strategic power in the economy, to shut it down when they go on strike. I'm all in favor of that. But of course, in order to harvest the benefits of that, you'd have to have a more friendly labor regime, and everything the Trump administration, both first round and second round, has done has pointed in exactly the opposite direction, made it harder and harder, right? To organize.
That's what I'm saying. You need that, like you need a because even with the Biden administration actually was probably the most pro-labor administration since LBJ, easily the most pro-labor administration since LBJ. The union density in the private economy stayed stuck at 6%. So, like you don't need to convince me that basically Trump's labor policy has turned out to be like George W. Bush on steroids. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, saying that it's the most pro-labor administration since LBJ, it's like William F. Buckley in his obituary for Michael Harrington said he was the most important socialist in the United States, which is a bit like being the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas. Right, that's the bar is very low, right?
But they did a lot. They did a lot, and the 6% did not budge. So then you have to think about what else could be done, could have been done. Whatever.
Well,
maybe there's.
I mean, one thing that they could have done, right, would be to pass the PRO Act, because the United States has probably the most regressive labor laws in any modern industrialized Western democracy, certainly up there, right? For people who aren't familiar maybe with some of the mechanics here, right? I mean, this is like, if under current American labor law to organize a union in a workplace, even after you've got a majority of the people who work there on board, you have to wait for a NLRB supervised union election during the lead up to the election. Your employer can make you go to meetings at work where they give you anti-union propaganda and threat to shut the place down. There's no right to respond. Union organizers don't have to be led on the premises. If by some miracle you win after all of that, and they drag their feet in initial bargaining and you go out on strike, it is illegal for one group of workers to strike on behalf of another, but it is perfectly legal for your employer to permanently replace you. They can't fire you, but they can permanently replace you, which is a fascinating legal distinction, right? And the PRO Act, which they said they were for, right? Would have fixed at least some of those issues, right? It brought the United States a little bit closer to more standard labor regimes in liberal democracies. Which, again, I have to say, like, this is something that's been something we've gone back and forth about a bit over the last several years, because whenever I see one of these, Republicans who I think, at various points you found hope in that they might actually, they might actually mean a little bit about it, right? This is a point that I'll always make, right? Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, etc. None of these guys are behind the PRO Act, which I have to say strikes me as a pretty minimal standard. I mean, Chuck Schumer supports that.
Yeah, so the PRO Act is look. Let's get into it. So the I support the PRO Act. I'm on the record supporting the PRO Act. But you have like the realities of a Republican Congress being the way it is, and we can get into why that is and the limitations of the Republican Party itself. But there is, there are pieces of the PRO Act which if you poll individual Americans, they immediately will back up, which is this support. Right. So the fact that after if a union election has been won, employers should not be able to drag on the process, because after a year, right? Like you can't then you won your election, your NLRB election, you need a contract right away, or at least within a reasonable time. And so there is an act now which Josh Hawley, a Republican, and Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters are pushing together. And it's got support from someone like Moreno, the Ohio senator, and it's called something like the Fast Contracts Act or something like that. And it's a piece of the PRO Act, not the full comprehensive PRO Act, but that element of it, which is if you won your National Labor Relations Board election, then your employer is obligated to negotiate in good faith within a year such that you can get your contract. So there are things like this happening, but for the most part, I'm not like trying to push back against you, but I'm basically with you. I think a lot of it is, there's been a lot of pseudo-populism. In fact, in Tyranny Inc., I called it conservative pseudo-populism, and it's this kind of, populist talk, not married to anything kind of substantive when it comes to labor rights and all of that. I think what's useful now, I think, is to recognize that and say its limitations, but then to see for the left that's out to sort of, that is poised to seemingly to win, a good midterm election. Possibly in 2028, things are looking bad for the Republican Party because of the Iran war. So, like, where specifically to go? And here, I would be careful about saying, looking at the 19th century and saying, well, farmers were against tariffs. And basically, farmers in this country have always been hostile to the manufacturing interest, right? And that they have their reasons, and it's completely understandable. But I think as I see the left trying to think, like, what do we think about political economy? And I've become worried about the left falling for, the kind of small business type of interest and all of that. That's what kind of holds back the Republican Party. Actually, if you want big egalitarian change, you should want large firms.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. That last part at all, and I'll also note that I was pointing out the contrast between McKinley and the Populists to say something about the obvious limitations of tariffs as a.
No, McKinley was the progressive force in some way, objectively, not because of his subjective views, but in the sense that manufacturing goes hand in hand with big industrial development, which is easier to unionize, et cetera, et cetera. At various points, like the AFL-CIO sided with Republicans holding its nose because they care about manufacturing.
Right. It is also the case that, that the entire, community of big capital, supported McKinley, and they knew what they were doing, right? Because they were going to, even if maybe there was some risk that they get increased unionization, although the McKinley administration certainly had their back against that, right? They, it was going to help them make a lot of money, right? Because it doesn't, because the sort of core of what a tariff is doing is it's protecting domestic capitalists against foreign capitalists. It's any effect on the working class is going to be indirect and is often somewhat ambiguous. It can point in both directions. Now, I'm again in favor of tariffs when used in a reasonable way as a tool of industrial policy. I'm fine with that, right? And I also think that it's interesting to connect what you just said, right, about business size, which I basically agree with, and what you said to begin with about Christian and social democracy, because of course the original social democrats, at least, and we can talk about the trajectory, right, of social democracy since then, but the original social democrats didn't think that, given lots and lots of competition, that the market would be a realm of freedom, right? They thought, look, even if, you mostly had small employers, it's still the case that the workplace tyranny that you wrote about would arise, under those circumstances. Because even if you have a really tight labor market, it's easy for you to get another job. When you get another job, it's going to be the same basic deal, right? There will also be another for-profit capitalist who you have to spend all day at work doing what they tell you to do, and et cetera, right? And so they saw the goal as to start out by achieving reforms that improve the lives of working class people in the here and now. That was called the minimum program. And then there was the maximum program, which was overcoming that, entirely in favor of a different economic system. And I don't want to bury the lead here, because as much as I think that, for at least some purposes and with some audiences, I would be, I think I'm making myself look better rhetorically if I just focus on sort of short-term left populist goals. That's not actually my view, right? My view is that real serious left populism is a long step in the right direction. But eventually, if you're going to get to the nub of what's wrong with our society and how it could be better, you need to go beyond that. You need to stop thinking in terms of the people and the elites, which is a sort of imprecise stand-in for what would be a ultimately more useful view, which is that it depends, the people is not one thing. The people, is divided into different groups who have different interests depending on whether you work for a living or you work for other people who do, right? And I think that if if you want to eventually overcome that workplace tyranny that you wrote about, and not just soften its edges, right? Eventually, you do have to do something about that, right? And I mean, I am very, like kind of the ray of hope you gave us earlier was about what the sort of left-wing inside baseball term for what you were just saying was accelerationism, which is the idea that if things get worse, then they'll get better because people get so angry that they've gotten worse that, they'll resort to more radical things. And I have to say the track record of that doesn't seem great to me, right? Like it usually doesn't seem to work out that way.
Actually, well, considering that, sometimes I wonder, like, how much of this is constrained, how much of the conversation is constrained by the two-party duopoly? Because it feels like, there's aspects of Ben's view that coagulate with your view, but then you're still constrained by this two-party system, where in my personal view, both the conservative and democratic establishments are beholden to their donors. They're beholden to, major corporations, such that, like, it kind of like in Eddington, you always just get like sucked back into the machine, even if you had populist ideals, like for real, genuinely, authentically. But if there was a Labor Party and or if we had ranked choice voting, and maybe you could have a, I don't know, Christian Social Democracy Party, and then you could have a Social Democratic Party and see who wins out. But
so American parties have always been these going really back to the founding, but really the parties we get. The Democratic Party was founded by Andrew Jackson and his Vice President Van Buren. The Republican Party, as we know it, obviously was founded by Lincoln. But both of those interests they kind of like permutated through the founding and early republic, even before they had those kinds of clear structures. And they've always been large kind of agglomerations of class-based, regional, religious, racial identities and interests. And, I think that's, I think there's one way in which that's not such a bad thing if you think the system as a whole is in need of reform, because if you win enough in the internal battles of each party before an election, then you get an entire party representing these vast numbers of interests and group of people that represent that idea or that impulse or that grievance that you have. Whereas in Europe, for example, you do have the sort of much more kind of niche parties that each represent, that you have the far right that wants to uphold the welfare state but kick out all the immigrants. You have the Communist Party, typically. You have the socialists, you have the Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, et cetera, et cetera. But what that means is that, like, in a way, in those systems, you can also contain the radical elements. If you really care about populism in its true sense, if you care about the majority being able to will their way, somehow you can like sort of isolate them as well. Whereas in this system, if you manage to take control of one of the big parties, that's it. You have one of the big parties in question. So I don't know. I guess my point is, like, I think people who care about bringing about an economy in which ordinary people have a greater say in how we manage things, and all the things that I think people in this room typically care about, like, play within the rules of the system because they can be pretty advantageous. Like, be good entry, take over the Democratic Party and marginalize the. So I don't want to like be like, oh, if only we had this kind of multi-party democracy. Like, this is the system that like is political reality has bequeathed to us.
But how much could you live with? Like, are there aspects of, let's say, Mamdani's tenure right now that you feel amenable to, but there are other aspects of it that You know what I mean? Or let's say there is a right-wing, like a real right-wing populist who holds these conservative, certain conservative, perhaps like social cultural ideals, but would grant us, social democratic reforms. I mean, how much are you willing to live with or put up with in this sort of two-party system?
Well, so I guess I'd separate out a couple of issues. I think that if we just had a magical genie, you could ask, honestly, I don't know that this would be one of my top three, but if you were going to use one of your wishes on this, right, and you said, okay, instead of having the two-party system we have now, you can have like a real multi-party democracy with, you mentioned ranked choice voting and et cetera, right? I'd be for that. Not even necessarily because I think it would make a giant difference to the outcomes that I care about, but I would just be in favor of it on grounds of democratic principle, right? I think that would give voters more choices and that would be better, right? I have, I'm a democratic socialist. I care a lot about democracy. I actually think a big part of the effect of the second Trump administration on me is that in a strange sort of way, I think the amount of authoritarianism we've seen in the last year and a half has negatively polarized me into realizing that I'm much more attached to a lot of existing American institutions than I would have necessarily thought. But that said, I also think that it would be a very bad mistake to think, okay, well, the strategy, the order of operations is first we completely change the electoral system, and then we'll work on getting a social democratic program in, because I don't think there's any way it would happen that way. I don't see what the mechanism would be. I don't get the theory of change. We're just going to convince the existing party establishments to do this thing that they would worry that would disempower them. I don't really understand how that would work, right? So in a sense, I think I actually just agree with Sohrab about this. I think that what history has bequeathed us is, I think not great in a lot of ways, but I think that it is the reality that you have to, work within. And I think that stuff like the fact that, look, where we're sitting right now, we're sitting in the biggest, most important city in the entire capitalist world, which is now the executive in that city is a member of DSA. That seems like it's easy to get numb to that, but I think that that's pretty exciting proof of concept for the potential of the strategy to work. And honestly, I worry a lot about my friends and comrades on the socialist left not having the strategic patience to keep plugging away at whatever has worked best, right? That people sort of say, oh, Bernie lost twice, you have this, that, or the other disappointment. And you can, look, yes, obviously, we're not living under socialism or even in a version of the United States that has achieved a social democratic minimum program. So whatever the left has been doing, hasn't been successful. But I think what you have to do is you have to measure degrees of failure, right? What's failed the least? And this seems like by far the thing that failed the least. You had a democratic socialist come in second in two presidential nomination contests. You have several in Congress. You have the mayoralty of New York City. This seems like, I think that ultimately to be successful, you would need heavy battalions of organized labor to back it up, and there is a real problem here. I think I saw recently Matt Karp, who's a historian at Princeton, a socialist writer, say, we need both chickens and eggs right now, right? As far as electoral strategy to get politicians who would give us better labor laws, and also, concrete union strength in the workplace of a kind that seems like it would have to be the backbone of any successful social democratic movement. And that's a real problem, right? Finding ways to develop the chickens and the eggs simultaneously. But I also think that it's kind of the only game in town.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, look, you asked like, what can you live with a Zoran? And I have to say, like, I do. I'm a resident of
You don't have a choice.
of the borough of Manhattan and of New York City, and
You don't believe that Sohrab could find another jurisdiction to live in?
No, yeah, but
I think
like,
he has a choice.
No, that's true. But look, I gotta say, first of all, like, you know,
is here.
the neither the gulags nor the official, like, you know, jihad has materialized, right? Like, it's like he's you know, I was making fun of this stuff on the right where they were like, you know, memes of like the Statue of Liberty covered in a burqa. I'm like, have you seen his whole life? Like his lifestyle? Like, is really, you think he's gonna?
Yeah, I've seen the First Lady of New York City. She doesn't dress like that.
Yeah,
but I think it is good. I mean, I think he is emphasizing, he's actually governing fairly small c conservatively in the sense that he's showing himself to be a good manager of the city. He is not doing anything like policing the city or anything like that. He's kept in place a kind of law and order police chief, commissioner in Jessica Tisch, and who
the left will still grapple with that, but probably not the right.
But like, I think it's a really smart move politically, and I think that, you know, the question is, what's like the big socialist thing that he'll do? And I think the thing that matters the most and would really like bring me on side to him more than just being like, well, this isn't so bad, is housing, right? Like, actually like a massive buildup of housing, which cannot be done again on a small business basis. That's what you're talking about, like a Galbraithian vision of what, you know, the American economy is capable of, is like building up lots of housings. Increasing supply is a huge problem in all of our large cities. So that means overcoming the kind of NIMBYs on every side. And you know, I don't think that the grocery stores, they're harmless. I don't think that's going to change anything. Making buses free, yeah, okay, you know, it's fine. But like the real rub will be the housing buildup, which we need. Like, it should not be the case that like a 1-bedroom in the city costs like $5,000. That's absurd. And it's like a clear case of irrationality of the market. And the answer to it is actually, in some ways, a market answer, but government can help. Is like more supply.
Yes. I really do want to get into immigration because.
So just really quickly though, right?
Yeah.
You know, because I think this is important, and I don't want to get lost. And
but have you seen his wife's likes on Instagram? She liked a Tucker tweet.
Yeah. If you had told me in 2024 that in 2026 there would be a Democratic socialist who quoted Eugene Debs in his victory speech would be the mayor of New York, I would have been very happy. If you told me that it was going so well that the right would be reduced to doing investigative journalism on his wife's Spotify playlists, I think I would have been ecstatic, right? You know, and I do just want to say more substantively that, you know, I think, yes, housing. I mean, I think that there should be a large role there for building municipal housing. I think that there are actually good precedents for that from around the world. I'm also in favor of both and in that, right, with cutting red tape, you know, for building private sector housing. If I could snap my fingers or ask that magical genie, you know, I would love some like larger structural economic changes that would make us be able to do it all with the first thing, but I don't think we live in that world right now. But I also do think that, you know, building a few public grocery stores, making the bus fast and free, these were all small incremental things. But I think if you can do a few good socialist small incremental things, nothing collapses as a result. You know, you have an overall good governance record. it might not sound that exciting, but I think that's actually pretty huge as far as the power of good example going forward.
I'm sorry, I don't want to cut into like Q&A time. So where are we?
no.
We're going to bring up immigration.
Okay,
Yeah,
well, we'll get to
I feel like we'll get to that, and then we'll go.
But very, very quickly, like, first of all, this is not it does not connect to our larger conversation at all. But I will say the point where I was like, wow, this is a great politician and actually speaks to something. When I'm talking about Zohran Mamdani, is it speaks to something in the country beyond New York City. Was obviously lots of people on the right commented on it as well, which was his primary debate among Democrats. And at one point, the typical question was asked, "What's the first foreign country you'll visit?" And every single one was like, "I'll visit our Jewish Democratic ally Israel." And he was just like, "I'll stay here because I'm a mayor of, it's like I'm a municipal official, a would-be municipal official, and I look forward. And if I need to connect with my Jewish constituents, I'll go to the local synagogue." That was such a good answer, and he endeared him to me. But here's what I say: is like this is the kind of conservative socialism side or conservative social democracy side, which is totally, I'm all for public housing. There's no reason why like all public housing should be regulated or created and offered by the market. There is a place for public housing, and it was like a big part of that kind of mid-century order was like veterans coming back, they need housing. So you have like Peter Cooper Village, et cetera, et cetera. But like the part of it where it's like it would have to tip in the right direction is public housing must not become synonymous with, disorder, right? And like to that's the part of like I think the 2020 style millennial left lost sight of, which I think Zohran is extremely vigilant against, which is to his credit, is if you believe in subjecting our economy to rational deliberation and control, then that also should apply to like ordinary day-to-day life of like how people interact on the subway, in NYCHA housing, et cetera, et cetera. Like it should not be a place of disorder. And I think that requires a certain kind of courage, which would not have seemed at all strange to lots of socialists and social democrats in the 20th century to be like, well, we have public housing, it's nice. No, you can't do graffiti on it because the people paid for that and the people who use it deserve to live in like a clean environment, And I think that's the kind of thing where I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying like that's.
Yeah, I would not disagree with that at all. Actually, I think I might. I think I might earn the eternal enmity of a couple of people who might be here who would otherwise be on my side. If by saying that, for example, a couple of years ago, a very good friend of mine in real life, Anna Kasparian, got endless shit for making some of these points, and I think she was basically right. I think that, I think that there are many good and important ways that policing could be reformed in the United States, but I also think that unless we're talking about like the communism of the 23rd century or something, right? I think you do need professionalized law enforcement, and I think that this is one of several subjects where I think that that much of the left has gotten a bit too libertarian. That there's this sort of view that the solution is for government to just sort of back off rather than trying to get better government, right? Doing a better job of it, right? I think that I think public safety is ultimately a public good that oftentimes sometimes even needs to be funded more to be done justly and well. None of that's to say that there aren't all sorts of ways that actually existing policing can be can involve excessive force, can violate people's rights. That there aren't all sorts of reforms that would be useful here, but I also think that the class politics of sort of knee-jerk anti-cop stuff, I think don't really reflect what we ultimately need, right? That there is a way in which a lot of the existing base of the left comes from downwardly mobile professionals, and there's nothing wrong with that. I actually think it's a good thing when, large, massive, downwardly mobile professionals sort of seek common cause, with the working class and see their interests as being aligned with the working class. I think that's good. I think that's indispensable, actually. But I also think that it's dangerous when those people's sensibilities come to dominate the left too much. And I do think that working class people of all races worry a lot, actually, about street crime, right? So I think that I would take some left self-criticism on that topic, right? I think that the right solution is not the politics of 2020. Of course, I also think the right solution is the increasingly deranged and authoritarian politics of the second Trump administration, which maybe does get us to the immigration question.
Well, yeah, and it kind of encompasses, I guess, what we would call peak 2020 downwardly mobile professional class leftism with regard to, I guess, just where people go with it, in the sense that I feel like with immigration, we have this topic where you have people who, in my view, kind of weaponize actually immigration is, pushes down wages and is bad. Not you. You seem to be someone who actually believes this on principled grounds, but then it feels like there are people out there who say that, but they have some other, perhaps more malicious motives about why they don't want immigrants in the country, why they don't want, certain people in the country. And they kind of hide behind this facade of, it's about the economy. It's about, bringing wages down and things like that. But I think this is kind of a weak spot of the left, because the left doesn't want to seem racist and they want to welcome immigrants. And because they are reacting to that weaponization, which I think is legitimate, right? But at the same time, when we get into this conversation about populism, about social democracy, I personally feel kind of weak in how I'm going to make this argument for immigration, because I have seen some of these arguments about wages being, depressed if we just have, as you have stated, infinity immigration. So how make the argument for why, you're anti-immigrate or infinity immigration, and then we can go to Ben.
No, I'm broadly. I think this is a one. If you're lined up to like various issues between me and Ben or many typical left of center people, like I would so sign up for many things on the left. I think this is the one issue where at least the left in its early 21st century iteration, I part ways. And I have to, first of all, declare my own standpoint epistemology, which is I'm a migrant. I'm a product of chain migration and the what's called the family reunion, program. So I got my visa and green card through an uncle who settled here decades earlier before I came in the late 90s. But so over time I've come to a broadly restrictionist position that is not blood and soil, because like I said, I'm an immigrant and my wife is also an immigrant. She's from China and she came here when she was 13, 14. And I came here when I was 13, 14. So we don't have that kind of like preserve the original American nation kind of thing. But I like I said, as you can tell, I come from this kind of trying to preserve a kind of late New Deal, social democratic, Christian democratic politics. And it is notable the fact that the period that lots of Americans look back to as like an economic golden age, they saw their wages rising, et cetera, coincided with actually the most restrictive immigration regime this country's ever had, which is roughly from 1929 to the 65 Immigration Act. And like lots, it's not, I don't want to pretend like there's a sort of right-wing argument that's like bringing out a whole bunch of iconic or canonical left figures who are immigration restrictionists. I'm not saying that that's sort of uniformly the case, but there was this strand of left labor and kind of progressive Democrats who were skeptical of unlimited immigration for economic reasons. Obviously the case people will always remember is Bernie Sanders being asked about it and he's saying, open borders, that's a Koch brothers idea. But there's others, Cesar Chavez, and there's the Barbara Jordan, who was this kind of protege of LBJ and ended up writing Bill Clinton's Commission on Immigration Reform. Again, like first black woman elected to the Congress from the South since Reconstruction, et cetera. So it has all these kind of solid, non-racist credentials, but she came to the conclusion that family reunion-based immigration is a disaster for working class people. Paul Krugman, of all people, in 2006, I love to quote this column. I often in debates on immigration, I will say, as Steve Bannon wrote, and I'll read off his quote, and he's like, well, they depress wages especially for only high school educated Americans. They put strain on public services, et cetera, et cetera. And only afterward do I reveal that no, it wasn't Krugman who said, it wasn't Steve Bannon who said this. It was Paul Krugman, like in the mid-aughts. So that's where I come from on this. So it's got to be a kind of reasonable place that we come to. What happened under the Biden administration, obviously, wasn't working. And I don't buy the sort of typical left line, which is we let everyone in and then we will sort of, step one, let in as many low-wage migrants uneducated migrants as you can. Step two, question mark. Step three, we'll get to socialism. Like, I feel like there's a missing link there. And anyway, there's like all these studies, and I know there are counter studies, but there's serious studies that show that there's a sort of negative correlation between, relatively unrestricted or migrant flows on the one hand and union density in this country on the other. I think of it as there's a reason why, like the Cato Institute and the Wall Street Journal editorial page and lots of other kind of pro-business libertarians are like, yes, we should have lots of immigration. Does that mean that therefore we should have none to oppose the Wall Street Journal editorial page? Okay, no. Should we have like an inhumane immigration? No. But it has to be recalibrated somehow, because I worry, that we are on the cusp of something where it could be very helpful for economic progressivism, which I support, as you can tell. But the electoral Achilles heel of this is if we go back to basically 2020 style views on immigration, which is where the left can't define why shouldn't everyone just come over? Like, why shouldn't every other person on the globe theoretically be thought of as an American in waiting? I think that's very dangerous electorally, and I think as a policy matter for working people.
All right.
I took a long time. So
No. I just want to make sure. Well, this is interesting. And I would say just as a note, right, that the sort of history of left and labor immigration restrictionism we just heard is a pretty standard one. Every time I've heard this, I've heard some of those same names, Barbara Jordan, Cesar Chavez, etc. And that's all true, right? I would point out that I'd never ever seem to hear Barbara Jordan's name in any context except for this one in 2026, right? It's not like, socialists or even normie liberals are out there praising Barbara Jordan all the time. And they all go, do you know your beloved Barbara Jordan said this? Like, it kind of feels like the first step is always explaining who Barbara Jordan was. And even in terms of the labor precedents, it certainly is true that, that you can find prominent figures in the history of the American labor movement who are immigration restrictionists. But I do have to say, it's maybe interesting that those tend to be the politically moderate wing of the labor movement, right? That, you have, for example, Samuel Gompers of the AFL was an anti-immigrant guy, but an
immigrant himself.
But he would say things about, they were very much like what you just said, right? But for example, IWW, the Wobblies, who are the people who are the closest to doing what you were recommending earlier, right? About the, sort of using these really militant tactics. Let's have strikes all the time. Those people didn't have a trace of that position, right? None of the socialists and communists who were instrumental in the sit-down wave of the 30s, for example, to the best of my knowledge, right, really advocated that position. So I think the labor movement's been very historically mixed on this. And even Bernie Sanders, right, in that quote, I think there's a little slipperiness here because the contemporary right tends to equate anything that they don't think is restrictionist enough with open borders, right? So you hear all this stuff about how we had open borders under Biden, et cetera, right? Which I have to say, as somebody who routinely crossed the Mexican border, right? While Joe Biden was president, it did not seem very open to me, right? It's.
Well, you were going through the official crossing.
Okay, but an awful lot of people were
swimming across the Rio Grande.
Sure, and that exists, but there were also an awful lot of people who were caught and deported, right? For doing that. And I would also point out, even putting aside the socialists and communists and Wobblies, even with the history of the Democratic Party, I mean, like the thing that stands out to me about the story as you just told it, right, is that 1965, that was LBJ, right? Who was the most social democratic president, relatively speaking, we've had since FDR, and the sort of kind of harsh punitive immigration enforcement we have right now was really more than anything the baby of the Clinton administration in the 1990s, at the same time that they were leading this lurch towards neoliberalism economically. And of course, now we have the Trump administration that's both dramatically ratcheting up immigration enforcement and trying to destroy the last lingering protections of union organizing rights, right? So these things have certainly always, not always marched together in that direction. But putting aside the history, I do find this interesting, right? Because as I said, there are many topics where I think Sohrab and I have sort of deep philosophical disagreements, but this isn't really one of them. I think this is something that in principle, it seems like could be navigated, right? With common premises. And I don't actually disagree with the premise that there are sectors of the economy, as you say, there's studies that point in different directions, but I broadly accept the premise where there are at least some sectors of the economy where competition from recent immigrants from lower wage countries is used by employers to drive down wages. I think that absolutely happens. I think it's silly to deny that ever happens. But I think acknowledging the existence of the problem is compatible with multiple possible solutions. And the idea that what we should do is try to do mass deportation of by some estimates, tens of millions of undocumented immigrants in the U.S., I have a problem with that for two reasons. One of those is moral. I think that it's wrong to hunt down peaceful working class people who are just trying to keep their heads above ground and provide for their families and aren't hurting anybody. And I think we've really seen what even a tiny bit of that deportation program that it would take to deport all those tens of millions of people. We've really seen how inhumane that gets very quickly, right, in the last year and a half. And I'm very skeptical that there's going to be a nice way to do that. So that's one point, it's the moral point. But also, strategically, I just don't think it's going to work, right? I think that certainly, even with the deep cruelty of the Trump administration in enforcing immigration laws in the last year and a half, it's barely enough to make a dent in the population of undocumented immigrants, which, by the way, lots of anti-immigrant people realize and are very frustrated by, right? Very, very, very loudly frustrated by. They know it's barely going to make a dent. And so you're going to leave the vast majority of people here. And then the question is, okay, well, what happens to that vast majority? And I always think here of my friend Stephen in Los Angeles, who is a union organizer. He used to work for SEIU and Unite Here. And people have this idea that every undocumented immigrant in the U.S. is a day laborer lined up in the Home Depot parking lot, and it's really not true. Certainly any big unionized hotel in Los Angeles, or I'm sure here, right, is going to have some undocumented workers who are members of it. And Stephen would describe to me these conversations that he would have. in the living rooms, these undocumented families, sort of spending hours convincing them that the information they put on a union card wasn't going to make its way back to the immigration authorities. And just imagine how much harder that conversation is going to be under the second Trump administration because of everything that's going to happen. So it seems to me that, yes, I think that I don't even necessarily disagree with Bernie's historical position that if we have completely open borders under capitalism, that could go badly wrong in some obvious ways. But I think that, when you're thinking about this problem, about desperate people who accept lower wages, who exist in this country in the tens of millions, I think that beyond the moral objection to the Trumpian solution to that, I also think it's not going to work, and in fact, it's going to exacerbate the problem. Whereas, if you let people become citizens, what can they do? They can come out of the shadows. They can take their employers to court when they violate labor laws. They can join unions without fear. And I think that's both morally and strategically, that strikes me as a much more promising strategy.
Yeah, well, look, here's the problem with that is the fact is that the Trump administration, despite what it's done on the sort of existing number of illegal immigrants or undocumented, whatever you want to call them, whether it's done enough or too much, or whether it's been cruel, et cetera, it has stopped the flow at the border, right? Like the border has become much less porous than it was. So in that sense, that's a perfectly democratic thing that, is elected to do, and it's achieved. Actually, it began under the Biden administration, the late Biden administration, but then the Trump administration really kind of completed that project. But so it's important to say, the question of who's coming in versus what to do with those who are already here, and that's a kind of distinction. I assume you don't want the former regime where more and more people could be sort of brought over and consume into the maws of the DoorDash economy, right? That's not good for them. It's not good for working people. That wasn't working, and that's kind of the response. Now, in terms of people already here, it's interesting. I actually think that the Trump administration is doing something very cynical, which is kind of terrorizing a subset of immigrants that are already here, but it's also simultaneously expanding various guest worker programs, right? So in the vision I've come to conclude of the likes of Stephen Miller, what they don't want is immigrants with rights, but they would love to have lots and lots of migrants who are kind of guest worker, essentially a kind of Qatar model. They want a kind of American kafala. And actually, people who organize at the UFW are very worried about this. They end up becoming more restrictionist than the administration, United Farm Workers, because they don't want this kind of American kafala. But I do think, look, if you agree that unregulated borders altogether are problematic and can be a boon to capital, especially in certain industries, construction, farm work, services, that obviously they want cheap labor. If you agree with that, then I think there's room to be so what do you do with the 20 million people who are already here? And I agree, cattle car deportation, is morally off the table. It's impractical. I think actually serious people on the restrictionist side, whom I know, and serious people on the other side, like UFW, whom I know, if you put them in a room together, they would come up with a solution tomorrow. It's just a matter of making the politics work, given how it is. But I think, and that solution is people who've been here for years and years. It's irrational and cruel to, deport. I think the restrictionists would say tomorrow they would sign on to it. There's serious restrictions, not the kind of Trump administration per se, but serious restrictionists at Numbers USA, et cetera, would see okay, let's sign the deal. The ones already here, regularize, right? So they pay taxes and they can do this and that. But a more tightly controlled border for newcomers.
So I think that the point about...
Would you take that deal? If you were...
Yeah, sure. I mean, if I were... I think that would be infinitely preferable to what we have going on right now, right? You were going to stop terrorizing people who are already here. You gave that population rights. beefed up, I mean, look, I think that there's a lot of cruelty in its own way that can happen at the border, but, I don't want to minimize that. But, I also think that, I also think that if somehow or another I were in a position where, where my choices were that or what we have right now, I would take that. In fact, I think that's more or less the platform that I see, for example, on, Plattner and in Maine, right? Like if you look at what he's said about that, right? It's probably more or less that. But
I think that's the outline of the immigration deal that everyone talks about, that is somehow can't be achieved, but also is like what everyone knows to be what we want.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the worst of both worlds is the legalized slavery of guest worker programs,
H-1Bs, H-2Bs.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, look, I was on Bernie's side when he when he was speaking out against the H-1B program. I think that any visa where you lose if you lose your job is very bad news for workers' rights, even for relatively privileged tech workers. But I think that the point about how what the Stephen Millers of the world want is American Qatar is really important, right? Like, you kind of mentioned, you said all this stuff earlier about the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute and all that, right? But I mean, I think in some ways the most revealing comment I've ever seen about this was from the late demon Milton Friedman, who had, there's a clip of him you can see on YouTube where he talks about how amazing immigrants are, but then he says, but only if they're illegal, right? Because otherwise, they're going to be getting government benefits, and you can't do any of that, right? So it's like, it's great, but only if it's illegal, right? Which because again, I think that the smarter the smarter advocates of this position understand that the sweet deal that they've got only works if these people don't have rights.
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of like how when Trump made the calls to like hospitality and farmers, or those industries.
It's like, well, they need work.
Never mind.
Yeah, never mind
Keep
about
them
that.
here.
And also did, I think, one of the strangest boutique forms of racism I've ever heard, which when he said that these are the only people who can do this farm labor, that urban people can't do it, which is if he's got this form of racism where he now thinks that Black people can't do farm labor, that's a strange historical reversal.
Well, considering that, I feel like maybe we can kind of wind it down, looking at like, who do you, if there are politicians or maybe people who aren't even running yet, who sort of embody your ideal form of populism. One thing I'm really curious about with right-wing populists is like, did you always think and believe that someone like Trump was legitimately a populist, would support labor, would be anti-interventionist? I did write down that I think it was 2022 that you wrote a piece that was like, Trump is our guy for the nominee. And then you recanted that recently in a piece that was like, he was never the one.
Yeah. So look, I think that which we haven't gone into at all, but I think on the foreign intervention front, Ben will disagree with here. And we've actually had public back and forth on this. So maybe not worth litigating, but like in circa 2022 or circa 2017, compared to all the presidents that came before him, he actually had a relatively a restrained record on foreign policy. He did. I mean, like, you could say, well, what were droning raids, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of like launching a full-on new intervention, he didn't do it. He didn't do it during his first term. And like, I think it's fair to say I think it's fair to say for people like me to be like, well, we were a little bit bamboozled because the 2024 platform was no new wars, stop World War III was at the top of the RNC agenda. I think in terms of domestic policy, he really had an opportunity. I mean, really mean this. If he had gone in a different direction beginning in early 2025 of the second term, he could have had a realignment that would last decades, right? You had like a fifth of African American men, half of Hispanic men, like depending on the sector, like half of the unionized workforce in this country. You had like some union like intrigued very much. I remember like when he named Lori Chavez DeRemer as his labor secretary, who had been one of the Republican sponsors of the PRO Act, which then she like recanted under.
I think but yeah.
What's that? No, there were three, and she was one of them. There's always like some random House members who are like really pro-labor, but anyway, like I remember Randy Weingarten was like, "This is great!" Like was cheering the choice of Lori Chavez-DeRemer, and I had friends from the AFL-CIO who were like senior leaders of the AFL-CIO were like, "How do we support her?" And at the time, I was like, "Well, actually, by like not publicly saying so, because that would kill her among Republican lawmakers. So like, keep your praise, private." I mean, he could have done a lot. Like he could, and he just went in this austerity drive, which didn't even cut much in terms of the budget with Elon Musk, and then like lots and lots of foreign wars. So I just think like in 2024 there was the possibility of like a generational realignment, which might have meant like on immigration something like the cruel regime that Ben deplores, and rightly so, but on other things like lines up in very interesting ways. Maybe even he could have been the person who does make that immigration deal. So that's like where I am. Like I think like there's like reason to be skeptical of some things, but reason to be earnest. Like well, that's good. That's not so bad. In terms of the earlier half of your question, like what do you look for? What's promising? I always like. I'm too old. Like I've put my trust in too many politicians, and like it always ends up. You always
Sort
end
of
up.
joker than I am.
I'm 41. You always end up with egg in your face.
That's
but
not old.
But no, it's not. I'm saying like generally I'm too old. I'm saying I'm too old to like be enthusiastic about any politician. But look, I think Abdul El Sayed in the Michigan race. I've interviewed him. I think he's very interesting. Some of the things he says, not just because of where he is on issues of the economy, but on sort of vice issues, he comes down on interesting places. He told me like, I think lots of young men in this country have problematic relationships with one of four things: porn, weed, online gambling. I can't remember what the fourth is, but at any rate, this sort of thing where he's like, as someone on the left, we need to rejigger where we are on cultural libertarianism, because clearly like that doesn't work. I would identify him. I like Chris Murphy on foreign policy. So there's like individuals out there, but
Yeah. Ben.
Well,
And do you have anything to say about his I know we don't need to go way too into the war of it all, but you did write a piece where you're kind of like, I told you so. I mean, that was before his recant.
Yes.
But you said that Donald Trump was never an anti-war president.
Yeah. I mean, this is a drum I've been beating for a very long time. So I guess just to start with your
that's not like what the neocons will say too. They're like, no, we love him because we always knew he would. That's what like.
Well,
some
of them.
No. I'm your audience because I kind of had the impression that maybe he wasn't anti-war, but he wasn't a war hawk. Like that was sort of my
so I think
top line understanding. But then,
sure, okay.
What are the facts? What are the receipts?
So I really hate that phrase, but I'll just use it this time, right? Okay. I do in fact come with many receipts. I promise I'll get to them in 30 seconds. But
because I think what we're trying to get to here is, are they selling a populist aesthetic? Are they selling an anti-war aesthetic? Or like, what are the receipts?
Yeah,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. And absolutely in 30 seconds, I promise we'll do that. I do just want to say, at the same time that Sohrab wrote that Trump is still the one article in 2022, that was one of a pair of dueling articles. I wrote the other one that they published at the same time because yes, you. It's not like I somehow stuck it into compact while he wasn't looking. He asked me if I wanted to write it, and I didn't really know didn't actually really know him very well yet. So I actually agonized a bit about whether I should be writing for these people, and I ended up deciding to do it. and I'm glad I did, right? And genuinely, right? I mean, this is one of the like slightly strange things about the format here. I think that I genuinely think that Sohrab is a great person, right? I'm happy to know, but I think that I will then say, perhaps jangling oddly against that last point, that my half of that I feel very good about, right? Looking back on it, right? That which was I wrote the case for Bernie, and and in fact I still think. I mean, even I'm not delusional enough to think that he's going to run for president at the age of 87. But I still think that if he had right last time around, that would have been the best possible option. I love Abdul Al-Sayed. I interviewed him twice in 2020, once for Jacobin, once for my podcast. I actually don't disagree at all with his observation about the percentage of young men with problematic relationships to ganja, gambling, and online porn. I will say, at least as an informal survey of the ones I know, that tracks. Right, we could talk about why that is or what to do about it, but I think I think it's kind of okay to acknowledge reality on that point.
You did?
No. Abdul did.
Oh, Abdul did.
Abdul did. But I mean, look, I despite my I mean, I am I'm somebody who defended him. Our friend Bhaskar Sankara, Jacobin, defended him. When he said that. I don't think that's wrong to acknowledge, right? I don't think we have to say that that it's actually that the epidemic of 19-year-olds losing huge amounts of money on sports betting is must actually be good and socially healthy, because it would sound too conservative to say otherwise. But yes, I love Abdul Al-Sayed. I'm a big fan of Graham Plattner, who I mentioned earlier. I think that even somebody like AOC, I've had my criticisms of her over the years, but I would support her, right? If it came to it. I think that's actually something you and I disagree about. But I think so. All of that feels pretty good to me, right? Because I think that those people that we just listed off, right? Bernie, Zoran, Plattner, etc., right? Like, are all people who I think show every sign of meaning it, right, on all of these topics. Whereas I think that the Trump administration, there was never really any reason to believe this, right? It's true that he didn't start any new major wars in his first term. It's also true that Obama didn't start any major wars in his second term. And in fact, I mean, it's unclear to me whether we really want to call the Libya intervention a major war. But if not for that, for that particular crisis, it's unclear to me whether Obama would have started in either in either term. And if we're going to compare the overall records of the last few presidents, I mean, Barack Obama, who I fucking hated, right? I think that, I mean, I thought then, and I haven't changed my mind, that in a world that took international law seriously, he would have been at The Hague for the drone war over the skies of Afghanistan and Pakistan and a lot of other things. But if we're going to compare Obama and Trump one, Obama gave us the diplomatic détente with Iran. That was huge. Trump tore it up in his first term. Yes, there are lots of neocons who hated him because he made anti-interventionist noises, but there were also several who joined that first administration. He had John Bolton in that first administration. The first administration, he assassinated Soleimani. And the only reason we didn't have a war with Iran in the first Trump administration was because of Iranian restraint in responding to that. I do think it's relevant that he doubled the rate of drone strikes. I think it's relevant that he did everything on the neocon wish list when it came to Israel-Palestine, from moving the embassy to Jerusalem, to re-specifying the West Bank and government documents as Judea and Samaria. I think that this was a pretty miserable record, and I think maybe the best thing you could say about it is that it's not as bad as Trump too, even on Ukraine, which was the issue that Republicans largely used to frame Trump as anti-war during the 2024 election. He sent heavy weapons to Ukraine in his first term that Obama had had refused to do because he thought it would be too escalatory, right? So I think that the foreign policy track record of the first Trump administration was pretty bad. Obviously, the foreign policy track record of the second administration has been much worse. But if you say, all right, what's the major cleavage between these two things, right? That we're just tearing up the JPCOA, assassinating Soleimani, etc., as opposed to starting an open-ended war with Iran. We're just trying to install Juan Guaido and not kidnapping the head of state in Venezuela, etc. It seems to me like the foreign policy analog to a lot of things in the first and second Trump administrations, which is to say that the amount of crazy behavior was less in the first one than the second one, probably in large part for the very reason that the Steve Bannons the world always thought, which was that in the first Trump administration, there were too many cucks who were getting in the way, right? Who wouldn't go along with Trump's craziest impulses. And now he's surrounded himself with yes men. So it's worse, right? So that would be my theory of the case.
Yeah, it's full of what's different is in the first term he was constrained by all these interagency processes, right? Like the deputy assistant secretary of deputy assistantship will like write a memo and then filters its way up, and then the CIA has its own memo, and then like they have a discussion, that. In the second administration, none of that exists. He just like watches Mark Levin, and like that's it. No, the National Security Council is basically non-existent. It just is like Laura Loomer and Mark Levin and then like Lindsey Graham, or like it's really like what could happen 2 years from now as he gets older and older could be really, really scary. But no, I agree. Just to your point, it's like I think a lot of the things that happened in the first administration ended up creating the grounds for the things that we now lament in the second administration. It's just that at the time you're like, well, killing Soleimani, like, you know what I mean? Like you could see that there was a way to frame that as actually like, okay, we're going to do one last thing in the Middle East, and it'll set the ground for disengaging from the Middle East, right? Like
this is the alcoholic's last drink, right? It's just gonna be one more, and then I'll be sober.
Speaking of which, I could use another one. Okay.
Well, speaking of which, maybe we can if you guys have any questions for each other, and we can
we should open it up.
We're good with. Does anyone have a question? I see. Vincenzo.
Leaving aside the argument about whether right-wing populism is actually populistic, where do you see secularism in the modern left populism and right populism? I feel like it's maybe one of the principles that is being really left behind in this sort of modern movement.
That sounds like a Sohrab question to me.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there is a version of religion that's always been attached to populism, which is God on the side of the people, on the side of the downtrodden, versus the elites. To go back to the Muff definition of populism as the drawing of a frontier between two sides like that. And that, to me, it's a very real thing, and it's an important thing, and we can get into the theology of it, but it's too complicated to get into it in a Q&A session. But I think, it's very clear to me now that especially when you watch like the Unite the Kingdom rally that just happened in Britain, there's a kind of very obvious instrumentalization of religion, which is like, it's really not about theology. It's really not about, like what biblical religion stands for in terms of like defining what social order should be like or anything like that. It's just like, we are this and they are that. And so like the cross, they like, will pick up, and then at the same time, they'll like pee on the streets. I'm talking about the Unite the Kingdom rally, which is a Tommy Robinson kind of far right rally. But like, I think that's just, as a, if I could step back from it, I just think human beings are religious animals. And so politics will always have a religious, metaphysical, theological, flavor to it. The question is whether or not what is brought to bear is reasonable religion and unreasonable religion. I think that is a very real and important distinction to my mind, and we'll get into it. I think biblical religion can be both reasonable and unreasonable. It has potentials for both. But that, possibly when you suppress more reasonable versions of the religious impulse from the public square, as a certain kind of hard secularism does, you will get the more unreasonable versions. And so here I would just point you for like, if you're interested in these questions in a way that I can't capture within just like a Q&A session, to Benedict's Regensburg address from 2016. I think it's very useful to be like, one way or another, the religious impulse will kind of burst forth, erupt into the public square. The question is whether you get a reasonable or unreasonable version of it. And we're getting lots of the unreasonable version for complicated reasons that are hard to like sum up in a quick answer.
I think that there are actually large elements of that. I would oddly agree with as a non-believer. I've always had a soft spot for the Christian left. But this does remind me that my friend Armand in Los Angeles, who's currently taking care of my cat, while I'm in New York, asked me to ask a question to you. So Armand is an Iranian American, and he asked how you could possibly betray your Shiite roots by converting to Christianity. And when he asked me that, I said, "But Armand, aren't you an atheist?" And he said, "Yeah, but that's not the point."
Was he Iranian or Armenian? I heard Armenian.
No, he's Iranian. He's Iranian. Yeah. So he said, "Yeah, that's not the point, right? You can be on Team God or Team No God, but if you're going to be on Team God, at least stick with ours."
Well, like Catholicism is the most Shiite Christianity. I'll just say that.
Well, and stay tuned to when maybe hopefully I ever get a podcast, because I did want to get more into the conversation about kind of like what you were saying with Abdul. Because I've heard you, it's kind of hard for me to explain, but I've heard you talk about how actually like this kind of collectivism is related to the cultural stuff and the way that do you know what I'm trying to say? Like how people think that like, gambling and porn addiction and all that stuff is not related to how we structure.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I often make this point and I think Ben will agree with this, which is what I find frustrating about the right, and which is why I sound the way I do, is like lots of conservatives, I think it's lamentable that lots of people are addicted to, online gambling or porn or whatever, or the fact that I think it's a problem for society, for our sense of meaning, for sense of continuity, that our, fertility rates are collapsing or the pews are empty, et cetera, et cetera. Although the pews empty question is actually, that's sort of changing, which is like conservatives have long lamented the emptying out of the pews, but now we have very full pews. But so set that, abstracting that issue, there are lots of conservative laments that I share with conservatives. But what infuriates me and what makes me often like where I'm like with Ben, and I agree with him on political economy in so many ways, is that obviously I think there's a link between how we organize our economy and people's ability to access certain higher goods. Like if you have to work like 3 gig jobs 3 gigs, none of which has any security, and you're working, you're like divided between them. Your schedule is irregular, et cetera. So of course you're not going to have the opportunity to be like, a person who has the time to cultivate religious belief, transmit it to your kids, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very easy for like gated community Christians to be like, yeah, it's great. Like, go back to religion and faith. But that actually requires a kind of material substrate, I think. Like, and when you look at my own life, like, in those instances in which I feel secure, that's then when I have time to like be like, okay, now I can say the rosary, et cetera, et cetera. But like when life is hectic and you never have a minute to breathe, and for lots of working class people, it's like that every day. It's not an exception. Then you can't like, so to merely be like, well, let's kind of morally police people or police their bedrooms without trying to offer something better about what life can be like materially it's just a failed politics. And yeah,
I think it's an interesting point. More questions? Let's do you first.
So I was wondering what your opinion is on, especially like with democratic politics. I know you're talking about the two-party system and how, multi-party system might be something of a mistake to jump into. But like, especially in the Democratic Party, we see that like the establishment actively fights against more populist progressive candidates. And like, even though they still win, like obviously Zoran is probably the biggest example. Like still, like with Graham Plattner, they tried to put in Janet Mills and like that kind of thing. Like, how do you think that we stop that? Because I feel like even though there are progressive candidates, like it's still like important to acknowledge that the establishment is still in control of the party.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the last part of your question maybe answers itself, that Janet Mills just dropped out because she was losing so badly in Maine, right? Which tells me that it is possible to beat these people. And I guess I think that there's a way that we often talk to each other about this on the left that is unhelpfully defeatist, and where it's often unclear to me what the contrast is supposed to be, right? Because anytime you're having a discussion about strategy, it's always comparative. It's always this strategy works better than that strategy. Because of course, right, if you're trying to agitate for reforms that would, deeply change American society, would, do something about some of those issues that Sohrab was just talking about. I mean, I'd maybe be happy if instead of using all that extra free time to find God, you just you read Bertrand Russell or something. But they have regardless of which one of those ways you go, right? I do want people, right, to have that free time and material security. And yeah, I mean, look, there's a reason that Medicare for all, shorter work weeks, all of these things don't already exist right now, right? That the people who have the most power in our society, know that stuff wouldn't serve their interests, right? So you're always going to get some sort of establishment that's trying very hard to resist any kind of movement to unseat them. I mean, that's just lamenting that is just kind of like lamenting, the weather, right? That's just the deal, right? Like the question is always what's the most effective way to overcome that? What's the sort of terrain of struggle in which those obstacles are going to be easier or harder to overcome? And this is why I'm often very frustrated, when leftists who say, oh, we need to, I don't know, we'll run Jill Stein for the 25th time, and this time maybe she'll get up to 2 or 3% of the vote. That we should try that strategy. It's like, well, hold on, yeah, sure. The Democratic establishment is going to try very hard to defeat insurgent challengers. Of course they do. That's their job. Fish got to swim. Birds got to fly. Right. But they're also, right, the establishment in both parties is also going to do everything they can to suppress third-party candidates. And in fact, they have many more tools for doing that, much more effectively, right? Graham Plattner, if he'd run as the Green Party candidate or had started, his own little, it's the Oyster Populist Party or whatever in Maine, right? None of us would know his name.
I wanted to ask specifically about housing reform in the city. I was thinking about, Ronnie's pied-à-terre tax and what's going on with Ken Griffin. And I was wanting to ask both of you, I guess, whether you see that as a critique of left-leaning populism, the pitfall of left-leaning populism, or whether that's a necessary, sacrifice for Mayor Mamdani's, agenda. Or I guess this would ask you what you say on that.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Sohrab, what do you think about taxing the rich from a right-wing populist POV?
Look, this is not a right-wing populist idea. It's just I think, look, the period that gave us the middle class in this country, and I mean the 3 decades after World War II, when like the New Deal order set in and became a sort of bipartisan consensus, actually was through the Nixon era. That period also saw working class people have, obtain health insurance for the first time, on a mass scale, disposable income, et cetera, et cetera. That period coincided with really, really high tax rates, almost like confiscatory tax rates. Look, I think I would generally say I would prefer that to happen at the level of pre-tax, pre-distribution, that is wages that are high enough, as opposed to post-tax redistribution. So there's a key difference there. Like, where do you do your redistribution? Do you do it at the level of wages for the most part? Or do you do it, like after wages have been settled and you have a fairly unequal distribution, and then you do various kinds of redistribution? FDR and the New Dealers always preferred the former. They always preferred pre-tax redistribution or pre-distribution at the level of wages. Why? Because that meant that, what working class people won would not be revocable by an act of Congress being like, well, now we're going to rejigger this, et cetera, et cetera. But still, I think, it is obscene. I'm going to sound like Bernie Sanders here, but it's just obscene that your average CEO makes 999 times the average worker in that country. And so you can tax that to an extent that is, still rational. I just doubt that you're going to have the kind of exodus that the likes of Ken Griffin warn of. I don't see any sign of it yet, at least in the city. Because there are various goods that being in New York City provides that I don't think they can do without. Pied-à-terre, if you can afford a second home in the city where you're that's worth more than $5 million, tax that shit.
Yeah, my God, if you're going to tax anything, this has got to be the place to start. The over $5 million second homes of rich people who don't even live in New York. And you'll also notice in terms of those predictions of a huge exodus of rich people gonna, decide that, they're happy to, of course, the people being taxed in this case literally already don't live here, but they have you're going to get this huge exodus. People always say, who are making this point, they say, oh, look at how much they're already paying. And they sort of make this big point about, how much, Ken Griffin's current tax bill already was or whatever. And they never actually get around to saying what the contrast is between his current tax bill and the new tax bill, right? What the actual percentage difference is. Because if you do, they'll be like, oh, you're actually not paying that much more than you were before, right? So look, in a certain sense, I think that, of course, I think socialism is the ultimate pre-distribution, right? That you're, because we literally had an economic system in which the people who are doing the work, decide how the revenue, is going to be allotted, right? That's pre-distribution turned up to 10, and all of the. Shameless plug. I co-wrote a book with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Beggs coming out this fall called The Blueprint, right? About, capitalism. And, one of the things we point out is that, in actual existing worker-owned firms like Mondragon in Spain, even though they have to compete against regular capitalist companies for managerial and technical talent, the highest differentials you get are like 6-1, 10-1, right? As opposed to these insane hundreds to one, ratios that you get in the normal private sector. But I would point out that even in terms of social democracy, right, which I think Sohrab sort of hopes will be the final stop on the train, right? As a way of getting a reasonable and orderly class peace. And I hope will be a stop on a train that continues to go afterwards, right? But even in terms of social democracy, I think successful social democracies have always done both, right? That they've always made it easier to organize unions and had pre-distribution in that regard, but they've also they have also done a lot of tax and transfer programs, and I think that the two complement each other, right? I mean, just to take the sort of obvious example about one of the biggest and most egregious differences between the United States and much of the rest of the developed world
It's healthcare.
is healthcare, exactly, right? That
Because if you have the security of healthcare, then you are willing to take the risk of organizing a union, even if it's going to mean that you're not going to earn a paycheck for a couple of, like, your most basic need of a healthcare is taken care of. So you can,
if you get fired, it takes some of the sting out of it. If you have to go on strike, it takes some of the sting out of it. In the late 1940s, right? That was a time when there were wildcat strikes all the time, and there were legally authorized strikes were happening all the time because people had agreed to a no strike pledge during World War II, and when that was done, there were all these pent up labor grievances, and there was a while when the auto industry, they were having strikes like every year. And so the UAW and the big three automakers got together in, I think, 1950 for what was called the Treaty of Detroit, which was they were going to do this big multi-year, contracts so that you wouldn't just be right back out and strike the next year. And as Sean Richmond tells the story in his labor organizing book, Tell the Bosses We're Coming, Walter Reuther and some of the big UAW people had always been reluctant to ask for health insurance benefits because they were good social democrats. They thought the government should provide that. And their theory about why they should ask for it in the Treaty of Detroit, why they ended up doing it, is after a few years of having to pay for their employees' health insurance, that the auto companies would join them in asking for national health care. And it's really interesting that never happened, right? And I think that the obvious explanation would be kind of the one you gave, right? That like they're self-aware enough to know that if everybody had health care, then they would have less leverage over workers. People would be willing to be more militant, take more risks.
The one word we haven't used this whole night, which is a whole other bag of tricks or bag of issues, is automation.
Yeah.
Right. And I just think, look, there is a point that comes in the third volume of Capital where Marx says, over time, direct labor inputs into because the factory and the machine will become diminished such that the worker becomes what he calls the, quote, watchman and regulator of the machine, or some phrase like that. And over time, what that means is, he says that, really it means the conquest of scarcity, and people can develop what he calls like their individual capacities. And then you get the true realm of freedom. Of course, there's a political step there, I think. But I talk about this because I have this book where I come out for various reasons. It's a bigger book. It's called The Triumph of Normal. But I come out pretty pro-automation because then there is this, it calls back to this part, the opening of politics, Aristotle's Politics, where he says, if shuttles could weave of their own and harps could play themselves, then masters would have no need of slaves. So
which Marx quotes in chapter 15 of volume 1, and he sort of points out, this isn't it interesting that this is never the way it actually works, at least under capitalism, right? That it doesn't actually reduce working hours, right? What happens with automation is that some people have to work as hard as ever, and some people are
fall out of work altogether.
Precarity, they lose their jobs, right? So I think that in principle, I'm wildly pro-automation in the sense that I think that the best possible society would be one where we all collectively and democratically ran the data centers together, and everything I mean, I kind of think there should be the death penalty for using generative AI to like write an article, but like putting that aside,
Grok,
right?
is that true? Grok, is it true? Should there
Yeah.
Should there be the death penalty?
Yeah. Tweeting Grok, is that true? I don't think should get the death penalty, but I think it should get you at least 6 months in prison. But putting aside those use cases, yeah, right, absolutely, right. I want to all of the mindless, dirty work. I would love to automate away if we had a social system where the effect of that would be that we would all have fewer working hours with no loss of income. The problem is that in the system that we have right now, it doesn't work out that way at all. So I'm very, in the short term, I'm very sympathetic to longshoremen, for example, resisting automation on the docks because it's not going to be used in that way. It could, in principle, right, that they could just reduce their hours with no loss of income, but it's not going to, because that's not the incentive of the people who are running the process.
Right. More questions? I think we might be.
Yeah. What?
Is that you?
Oh,
I guess you guys talked about like Abdul al-Said and Graham Plattner, but what about James Salrico in Texas as like a populist Christian, that kind of what are you guys' thoughts on James Salrico?
I honestly have not paid attention to his campaign. I've commissioned an essay from David Griscom, sort of a radical history of Texas. But so I just have to profess ignorance there. I did see that this is just classic. Like in 2020, he had some campaign or something, and he was just like, "I just want to like commend all my campaign staffers for." I can't remember what it was exactly, but it was something like we went vegan, and then like obviously this became like a Republican attack point. So his response to it was to just post a photo of himself biting into this like the largest rib you've ever seen. Like it's like, here I am, I love me.
Well, Arun took my in-person capital class in Los Angeles, where everybody would be very safe from that attack because every week after we finished talking about capital, there was always a core group that would included him who would go out for late night Korean food, and eat copious amounts of grilled meat and soju, and thus be impervious to that line of criticism. But I do also just want to point out that I think I could take some credit for this because you two took one of those classes. That whatever else I have or haven't accomplished in my life, there's at least one human being who both starts some sentences with J.D. Vance told me, and also knows what Marx says in Volume 3 of Capital.
Well, no, but it's sort of you're cheating there because I used to be a trop. So, I was
but you didn't read the book. No, nobody does in those groups.
No, I didn't. I certainly did not read book 3. No, in those 17-year-old days. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll leave it there, but I do feel like that's a good question to go into at another conversation, because I think I already see some Democrats doing the populist language, right? Like James Salrico. I haven't like dug into his record. Also, kind of Chris Murphy, kind of who's that hot guy from Georgia? You know what I'm talking about? John Ossoff. Yeah. Really good speaker, saying some great populist stuff, but can we trust him? What are the receipts? You got to check the record. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. I hope everyone enjoyed. We didn't get super spicy, but, they're very principled kings. So let's go hang out and chat. Wait.
All right, that was a really fun night, and yeah, always really enjoy talking with Sohrab. even on those areas where we disagree most intensely, immigration, etc. I think that, I think he's just one of the most thoughtful interlocutors you could have on that side of some of those issues. Very fun conversation. I hope that I hope that that Cynthia does start a podcast of her very own. Would be happy to come back to do a version of this conversation on that podcast if it happens. But meanwhile, we will call it there, I think, for today. We are going to be back on Monday, same time. So that's 1 p.m. East Coast, 10 a.m. here on the West Coast. As I said last time, or time before that, I don't remember, we have been doing a lot fewer of these episodes lately, and ended up kind of taking May entirely off because I've been working on adapting Matt Crispin's Kush vlogs into a book that, with any luck, they can start promoting that on Chapa maybe even at the end of this year or something if we really if we really get going on it quickly. So that has been taking up the vast majority of my time, but I do still want to try to do this a couple times a week if I could possibly maintain that schedule. As I said, we're going to be back on Monday. It is just barely possible that the Israel-Palestine debate that I did with Nick Matau will have been released by then. If so, we will play that. If not, there's a Sam Harris debunking I've been meaning to do, so perhaps we'll do that on Monday. But one way or the other, I will have something for you on Monday, and I will see you guys then. Left is best.